snatch my mom's phone. You've just messed with the wrong people.
Picture this. An 8-year-old black girl standing in the aisle of a commercial airplane, holding a cell phone in her small hands, staring directly into the eyes of a flight attendant who's gone completely pale. The cabin is dead silent. Every passenger in business class has stopped what they're doing. Some have their mouths hanging open. Others are leaning forward in their seats trying to hear better. The little girl's voice cuts through the silence, clear and unwavering. "My billionaire dad would end your career if you do this again." The flight attendant stammers, her face cycling through shades of red and white. A few passengers gasp. Someone whispers, "Oh my God." Another person starts clapping, slowly at first, then others join in. But hold on. I need to take you back. Because what you just witnessed, that was the explosion. And to understand an explosion, you need to know what lit the fuse. Let me tell you how we got here. It started 4 hours earlier at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Gate B34. Flight 847 to Seattle. Dr. Deborah Sterling walked through the terminal with her daughter Naomi's hand tucked securely in hers. Deborah was 34 years old, a pediatric surgeon at Emory Children's Hospital, and she was running on exactly 2 hours of sleep. She'd been pulled into emergency surgery at 3 that morning. A 6-year-old with a ruptured appendix. The surgery had gone well, thank God, but by the time she'd scrubbed out, filled out the paperwork, checked on the child in recovery, and driven home to shower and pack, she barely had time to make their 11 o'clock flight. Her surgical scrubs were still in her bag. She could smell the hospital soap on her hands even after 3 washes. Her eyes felt like sandpaper, and there was a dull ache building behind her temples that promised to become a full headache by the time they reached cruising altitude. But when Naomi looked up at her with those bright, curious eyes and asked if she was okay, Deborah smiled and said, "I'm perfect, baby. Just tired." Naomi Sterling was 8 years old, but she had the observation skills of someone 3 times her age. She noticed everything. The way her mother's shoulders curved forward slightly when she was exhausted. The tiny crease that appeared between her eyebrows when she was worried. The forced brightness in her smile when she was pushing through fatigue. Right now, Naomi noticed all 3. Naomi was small for her age, with neat cornrows that her grandmother had braided the night before, decorated with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved her head. She wore a purple dress with white sneakers and she carried a backpack that was almost as big as she was, stuffed with books. Not children's books. College-level textbooks. Right now, there was a copy of Introduction to Molecular Biology, wedged in there next to her iPad, and a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. Her teachers called her gifted. Her parents called her their little scholar. Naomi just called herself curious. But more than anything else, Naomi was protective of her mother. Fiercely so. She'd once made a substitute teacher cry by politely but thoroughly explaining exactly why the teacher's dismissive comment about working mothers was problematic. She'd been 6 at the time. They were traveling to Seattle for Barnabas Sterling's company gala. Barnabas was Deborah's husband and Naomi's father, and he was the founder and CEO of Sterling Tech, a software company that had revolutionized cloud security systems. The company had gone public 2 years ago, and Barnabas had become one of those names you saw in Forbes and Fortune. A billionaire at 38. But to Naomi he was just daddy. The man who read her bedtime stories in funny voices and let her explain quantum physics theories to him at breakfast even though she probably got half of it wrong. He'd flown out to Seattle 3 days earlier to prepare for the gala. Deborah and Naomi were supposed to join him yesterday, but then that emergency surgery happened, and Deborah had called him at midnight apologizing, rescheduling. "Come when you can," Barnabas had said. "The gala doesn't matter. You saving that child's life matters." Now they were finally on their way. Deborah had booked business class because after the night she'd had, she needed the space to maybe, possibly, hopefully catch a little sleep. Naomi didn't care about business class or economy. She just wanted her mother to rest. They boarded with the first group, found their seats for A and 4B. Window and middle. Deborah let Naomi have the window because her daughter loved watching the clouds. Naomi immediately pressed her face to the glass, watching the ground crew load luggage. Deborah sank into her seat and closed her eyes for just a moment. Just one moment of peace before the chaos of the next few days. That moment lasted about 30 seconds. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp. Clip. The kind of voice that turned a simple, "excuse me," into an accusation. Deborah opened her eyes. Standing in the aisle was a flight attendant. She was in her early 40s, blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun that looked painful, makeup applied with precision, uniform pressed within an inch of its life. Her name tag read Lydia Hartwell. She'd been with the airline for 15 years, and she wore those 15 years like a badge of honor. She knew the regulations. She enforced the regulations. She prided herself on running a tight ship. But right now, Lydia Hartwell wasn't looking at Deborah with the professional courtesy you'd expect from a 15-year veteran. She was looking at her with something else entirely. Something cold. Suspicious. Yes. Deborah said, her voice polite, tired. I need to verify your tickets, Lydia said. She held out her hand expectantly. Deborah blinked. I'm sorry? Your tickets? I need to verify them. Sometimes there are. Lydia paused, her eyes traveling from Deborah's face down to her casual jeans and cardigan, then over to Naomi's purple dress. Mistakes. With upgrades. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Deborah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd felt this feeling before. Many times before. In department stores where security followed her. In restaurants where the host seemed surprised by her reservation. In hospital board meetings where someone assumed she was a nurse, not the surgeon. But she was tired. So tired. And she didn't have the energy for this. Of course, Deborah said quietly. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, bringing up their mobile boarding passes. Lydia took the phone, holding it at arm's length like it might be contaminated. She studied the passes for far longer than necessary. Behind her, other passengers were trying to get past, but Lydia didn't move. She just kept staring at that phone screen, tapping, scrolling, comparing something. 30 seconds passed. 45. A minute. The passengers behind Lydia were getting restless. A man in a suit cleared his throat. A woman with a baby shifted her weight from foot to foot. Naomi watched all of this. She watched the flight attendant's face. She watched her mother's shoulders tense. She watched the way her mother's smile stayed fixed in place, gracious, patient, even though Naomi could see the exhaustion pulling at the corners of her eyes. Something wasn't right. Naomi knew it the way you know it's going to rain before the first drop falls. Finally, Lydia handed the phone back. Everything seems to be in order, she said, her tone suggesting she was disappointed by this fact. Thank you, Deborah said. Lydia moved on, but not before giving their carry-on bags a long, meaningful look. Across the aisle, an elderly white woman with silver hair and kind eyes caught Naomi's attention. The woman's name was Priscilla, though Naomi didn't know that yet. Priscilla had been flying for 50 years. She'd seen a lot. And she'd just seen something that made her heart hurt. Priscilla gave Naomi a small, sympathetic smile. Naomi didn't smile back. She just turned to her mother. Mommy, she whispered, why did she do that? Deborah pulled Naomi close, kissing the top of her head. Some people have hard days, sweetheart. We'll be kind anyway. But Naomi had seen her mother's hands trembling as she put her phone away. And Naomi remembered something her father had told her once, when she'd come home crying because a boy at school had said she talked too proper for a black girl. Baby girl, Barnabas had said, kneeling down to her level, never let anyone make you small. And never, ever let anyone diminish your mother. She's a queen. You come from queens. Don't forget that. Naomi hadn't forgotten. And as the plane filled up around them, as Deborah closed her eyes and tried to find some rest, Naomi stayed alert. Watching. Waiting. Because she had a feeling this flight was going to be longer than 5 hours. She had no idea how right she was. Now, before we go any further, if you're already invested in this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next? You're not going to believe it. And I promise you this is just the beginning. Here's a question for you. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly and wished you had the courage to speak up? Drop your answer in the comments below. But back to Flight 847. Because 30 minutes into the flight, Lydia Hartwell came back. And this time she wasn't just checking tickets. 30 minutes into the flight, Deborah finally started to relax. The plane had reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign had dinged off. Around them, passengers were settling into their routines. Some were reading. Others had laptops open. A few were already asleep, heads tilted back, mouths slightly open. Deborah had her tablet out, reviewing medical notes from the surgery she'd performed that morning. She wanted to check the post-op protocol one more time, make sure she hadn't missed anything in her exhaustion. The tray table was down just slightly, maybe 2 inches, just enough to rest the tablet at a comfortable angle. Her seat was reclined to the first position, the one the airline specifically designed for working comfortably. Naomi had her molecular biology textbook open, but she wasn't really reading. She was watching her mother's face, the way Deborah's eyebrows furrowed in concentration, the way she chewed her bottom lip when she was thinking hard about something. That's when Lydia appeared. She materialized at their row like she'd been waiting for this moment, watching from the galley, looking for any excuse. "Ma'am?" That same sharp voice. That same edge. "Tray tables must be up during flight. Safety regulations." Deborah looked up, startled. She glanced at her tray table, barely extended, then at the passengers around her. The man across the aisle had his tray table fully down with a laptop and a coffee cup on it. The woman 2 rows up had hers down with a full meal spread. But Lydia wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Deborah. "Oh, I'm sorry," Deborah said. She immediately folded the tray table up, balancing her tablet on her lap instead. "I didn't realize." "Federal aviation regulations," Lydia said, her voice loud enough that passengers 3 rows back could hear. "We take safety very seriously on this airline." "Of course," Deborah said. "I apologize." Lydia stood there for another 5 seconds, just watching, as if waiting for Deborah to do something else wrong. Then she walked away, her shoes clicking purposefully on the cabin floor. Naomi looked at her mother. "Mommy, that man over there has his table down." "I know, baby," Deborah whispered. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. Naomi could see that. She could see the tightness around her mother's mouth, the way her mother's hand trembled slightly as she held the tablet. Deborah tried to focus on her notes, holding the tablet at an awkward angle on her lap. The light wasn't right. Her neck was starting to hurt. But she managed. She always managed. 10 minutes passed. Deborah was finally finding her focus again, double-checking medication dosages, reviewing the surgical approach she'd used. The child was stable. Everything looked good. She felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. Then Lydia was back. "Ma'am, I need you to bring your seat to the full upright position." Deborah blinked, confused. She looked at her seat position indicator. She was in position 1, barely reclined. The airline's own safety card showed this position was acceptable during flight. "I'm sorry?" Deborah said. "Your seat isn't fully upright," Lydia said, her arms crossed. "I need you to adjust it." Deborah glanced around. Every single person in business class had their seat reclined. The man next to them was practically horizontal, his seat in the full flatbed position, snoring softly. But Lydia's eyes were fixed on Deborah. "Of course," Deborah said quietly. She reached for the seat control and brought her seat completely upright, a position so uncomfortable that nobody sits in it unless the plane is taking off or landing. "Thank you for your cooperation," Lydia said, her tone suggesting Deborah had been anything but cooperative. Naomi's hand found her mother's. She squeezed it tight. "Mommy," Naomi whispered, her voice so quiet only Deborah could hear, "why does she keep bothering you? Nobody else is sitting up straight." Deborah looked down at her daughter's face. Those intelligent eyes were filled with confusion and something else. Something that looked like the beginning of anger. Deborah knew that look. She'd seen it before, usually right before Naomi delivered one of her perfectly logical, devastating observations about injustice. Deborah stroked Naomi's cheek. "Some people have hard days, sweetheart. We'll be kind anyway." "But she's not having a hard day," Naomi said, her voice still whisper-soft but gaining strength. "She's being mean to you on purpose." "Maybe," Deborah admitted. "But we can't control how other people behave. We can only control how we respond." Naomi didn't look convinced, but she nodded and went back to her book. Except she wasn't reading. She was watching. Every time Lydia walked past, which was becoming more and more frequent, Naomi tracked her movement like a hawk tracking a mouse. Deborah sat rigid in her uncomfortable, fully upright seat, trying to focus on her tablet, but the light was all wrong now and her back was starting to ache. Around her, passengers dozed in their reclined seats. The man with the laptop still had his tray table down. A woman 2 rows up was watching a movie with her tray table extended, a glass of wine resting on it. But every few minutes, like clockwork, Lydia would walk past. Sometimes she'd pause. Sometimes she'd just slow down. Always she was watching Deborah. 15 more minutes passed. Deborah's back was screaming. The headache she'd felt building earlier had arrived in full force, pounding behind her eyes. She'd been awake for nearly 24 hours. She'd saved a child's life. She'd done everything right, everything she was supposed to do, and now she was sitting on an airplane being treated like she'd committed some crime. She finally allowed herself to recline her seat just slightly. Just to position 2. Just enough to take the pressure off her lower back. She closed her eyes just for a moment. That moment lasted about 90 seconds. "Ma'am?" Lydia again. Always Lydia. "I'm going to need to inspect your carry-on luggage." Deborah's eyes opened. "I'm sorry?" "Your carry-on bag. It doesn't appear to be properly stowed. Deborah looked up at the overhead bin. Her bag was exactly where she'd put it during boarding. It hadn't moved. It wasn't sticking out. It wasn't blocking anything. It was just there, tucked away neatly, the same as every other bag in every other overhead bin on this plane. I don't understand, Deborah said, and for the first time, there was a crack in her composure. A tiny fracture in that professional grace she'd been maintaining. My bag is stowed correctly. I need you to take it down so I can verify it meets our size requirements, Lydia said. That's when a voice came from across the aisle. That bag hasn't moved since takeoff. It was a man in his mid-40s, black man in an expensive suit, with salt and pepper hair and intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. His name was Silas Monroe, and he was a corporate lawyer flying to Seattle for a deposition. He'd been watching this entire interaction with growing disbelief. Sir, this doesn't concern you, Lydia said, not even looking at him. I'm making it my concern, Silas said. His voice was calm but firm. I've been sitting here for 45 minutes. That woman's bag has not moved. Not once. Lydia's face flushed. Sir, I need to ask you to mind your own business. I am minding my business, Silas said. My business is noticing when someone is being harassed. And that's what I'm noticing right now. Other passengers were starting to pay attention now. Heads were turning. Conversations were stopping. The cabin was getting quiet, that particular kind of quiet that happens when everyone knows something is wrong but nobody quite wants to acknowledge it yet. Lydia's jaw tightened. She turned back to Deborah, ignoring Silas completely. Ma'am, I need you to retrieve your bag. Now. Deborah stood up because what else could she do? She opened the overhead bin, pulled down her perfectly properly sized carry-on bag, and stood there in the aisle holding it. Turn it around, Lydia commanded. I need to see all sides. Deborah turned the bag. Slowly. Like she was being inspected at customs, like she was under suspicion, like she was guilty of something. Lydia examined the bag from every angle, taking her time, making a show of it. She even pulled out a measuring tape from her pocket, like she'd been preparing for this moment. The bag was well within size limits. Everyone could see that. Everyone knew it. Fine, Lydia finally said. You can put it back. Deborah lifted the bag back into the overhead bin. Her hands were shaking now. Not from the weight of the bag but from something else. From humiliation. From exhaustion. From the accumulated weight of 1,000 small indignities just like this one that she'd experienced throughout her life. She sat back down. Naomi immediately grabbed her hand. Across the aisle, Priscilla, the elderly woman with silver hair, leaned over. Dear, Priscilla said, her voice kind but troubled, I've been flying for 50 years. I've been on hundreds of flights. Thousands maybe. What just happened? This isn't normal. This isn't how flight attendants behave. This is something else entirely. Deborah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Naomi was staring at Lydia's retreating back, and if looks could burn holes, Lydia would be on fire. Naomi's small hands were balled into fists. Her jaw was clenched. She looked exactly like her father when he was angry, that same controlled fury that radiated outward like heat. Mommy, Naomi whispered, I don't like her. I know, baby, Deborah whispered back. Just a few more hours. We can handle a few more hours. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Because 10 minutes later, as Deborah was trying to calm her racing heart and restore some sense of dignity, Lydia appeared again. This time, she stopped directly in front of their row and pointed at Deborah's reading light. Ma'am, your reading light is disturbing other passengers. I need you to turn it off. Deborah looked at her reading light. It was on. So were approximately 15 other reading lights in business class. The cabin lights were dimmed. People were reading, working, watching screens. Her light was no brighter than anyone else's. I'm sorry, Deborah said, her voice barely above a whisper now, but I need the light to review my medical notes. Other passengers have complained, Lydia said. Which passengers? Silas called out from across the aisle. Because I haven't complained. Has anyone else complained? Show of hands. Not a single hand went up. Not one. In fact, several passengers shook their heads. The complaint was made to me directly, Lydia said, her face reddening again. Now, ma'am, are you going to comply or do I need to call the captain? Deborah reached up and clicked off her reading light. The screen of her tablet glowed in the dimness, but it wasn't enough. She couldn't see properly. The words blurred together. She closed the tablet. Set it on her lap. Stared straight ahead at nothing. Naomi was trembling now. Not from fear. From rage. From watching her mother, her brilliant, accomplished, kind mother, being systematically broken down by someone who had no right, no reason, no justification beyond cruelty. "Mommy," Naomi said, and her voice cracked on the word. "It's okay, baby," Deborah said, but they both knew it wasn't. Another 20 minutes passed. Deborah sat in the darkness, unable to work, unable to rest, unable to do anything except exist in a state of humiliated paralysis. Naomi held her hand the entire time, squeezing it periodically as if reminding her mother that she wasn't alone. Then Deborah's phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her pocket. A text message from the hospital. From Dr. Timothy, the pediatric resident who was monitoring her post-op patient. Patient showing slight fever. 100.8. Following protocol but wanted to inform you. Advise. Deborah's heart jumped. A post-op fever wasn't necessarily cause for panic, but it needed to be monitored closely. Could be nothing. It could be the beginning of an infection. She needed to respond. She needed to give guidance. The plane was at cruising altitude. The Wi-Fi symbol glowed at the top of her phone screen. She'd purchased the in-flight internet during boarding specifically for this reason, in case the hospital needed to reach her. She opened her messages and started typing a response, her fingers flying across the screen. Monitor closely. Check incision site for redness or swelling. If temp rises above 101, start broad-spectrum antibiotics. I'll call when we land. She was halfway through typing when a shadow fell across her. You can probably guess who it was. "Ma'am?" Lydia's voice wasn't just sharp anymore. It was aggressive. Accusatory. Electronic devices must be in airplane mode. Deborah didn't even look up. She was focused on her message, on her patient, on a 6-year-old child who needed her attention. "It is in airplane mode," Deborah said, still typing. "I'm using the Wi-Fi service." "I need to verify that," Lydia said. "Hand me your phone." Now Deborah looked up. "Excuse me? Your phone. Give it to me. I need to verify it's in compliance with FAA regulations." Deborah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. "I assure you it's compliant. I purchased Wi-Fi specifically to be able to communicate with my hospital. I'm a surgeon. I have a patient who needs medical guidance." "Ma'am," Lydia said, and her voice was rising now, getting louder, drawing more attention. "I am a flight attendant with 15 years of experience. I know the regulations, and I am telling you that I need to inspect that device. Now." "But other passengers are using their phones," Deborah said, gesturing around the cabin. And it was true. Visible from where they sat, at least 6 other passengers had phones out. A woman was on a video call. A man was scrolling through social media. Another was texting. But Lydia wasn't looking at them. She had never looked at them. She was only looking at Deborah. "Those passengers are in compliance," Lydia said. "You are not. Hand over the device, or I will be forced to report you to the captain for disobeying crew member instructions, which is a federal offense." The cabin had gone completely silent now. Every conversation had stopped. Every passenger was watching. Some were recording on their own phones, which was apparently fine, because Lydia didn't say a word to them. Deborah's hands were shaking. She looked at her phone, at the unfinished message to her colleague, at the medical guidance her patient needed. Then she looked at Lydia's face, at the satisfaction poorly hidden there, at the power trip playing out in real time. And Deborah made a calculation. She thought about her daughter sitting beside her. She thought about the viral videos she'd seen of passengers being dragged off planes. She thought about the fact that they were 30,000 feet in the air with nowhere to go and no way to escape. She thought about her patient, and she finished typing her message. Hit send. Then she looked at Lydia and said very quietly, "I need to respond to my hospital. A child's life may depend on it." "Ma'am," Lydia said, and now she was nearly shouting, "you are disobeying flight safety guidelines. Hand over the device now, or I will have you removed from this aircraft the moment we land." Deborah looked at her daughter. Naomi's face was wet with tears. Silent tears running down her cheeks. Her little fists were clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white. And Deborah realized something in that moment. She realized that her daughter was learning a lesson right now. Naomi was learning what it meant to be a black woman in America. She was learning about power and powerlessness. She was learning about dignity and humiliation. She was learning that sometimes, no matter how educated you are, no matter how accomplished, no matter how right you are, none of it matters if someone with even a small amount of power decides they want to break you. Deborah handed over her phone. "This will be returned to you after we land," Lydia said, her voice dripping with false professionalism. "If you cooperate." I have patients who need me, Deborah said, and now her voice did break. Just slightly. Just enough that everyone could hear the crack in it. Should have thought about that before breaking regulations, Lydia said. She turned and walked away, Deborah's phone clutched in her hand like a trophy. Deborah sat back in her seat. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, tears formed in her eyes. Not angry tears. Defeated tears. Exhausted tears. The tears of someone who had finally hit their limit. She put her head in her hands. Naomi watched her mother cry. And something happened inside that 8-year-old girl. Something shifted. Something hardened. Something that had been brewing for the last hour finally crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. Across the aisle, Priscilla had tears in her own eyes. This is discrimination, she said, her voice shaking with anger. I'm calling for the supervisor. This is wrong. This is so wrong. Silas had his phone out. I'm recording everything, he said to no one in particular. Every single thing. This is textbook racial profiling. But Naomi wasn't listening to them. She was watching Lydia walk back to the galley, watching her set Deborah's phone on the counter like it was contaminated, watching her smile to herself like she'd won some kind of victory. Naomi remembered her father's words. Never let anyone diminish your mother. She's a queen. Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt. Baby, stay seated, Deborah said, wiping her eyes, trying to compose herself. I'll be right back, Mommy, Naomi said. Her voice was steady. Come. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was now going to act on it. She stood up and walked down the aisle toward the galley. Toward Lydia. Toward her mother's phone. And every passenger who was watching knew, somehow, that they were about to witness something extraordinary. If you want to see what this 8-year-old girl does next, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because what happens in the next few minutes will absolutely blow your mind. And here's my question for you. If you were on that plane watching all of this unfold, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet or would you have spoken up? Drop your answer in the comments because I really want to know. But right now we need to get back to Flight 847. Because little Naomi Sterling just stood up. And she's walking toward a woman who has no idea what's about to hit her. Deborah Sterling sat in seat 4A with her phone in Lydia's possession, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not since medical school, when a professor told her she'd never make it as a surgeon because she was too emotional for the operating room. Not since her residency, when a patient's family demanded a different doctor because they didn't trust a black woman to operate on their child. Defeat. She sat there in that uncomfortable, fully upright seat, surrounded by passengers who were now openly staring at her with a mixture of pity and outrage, and she felt the weight of every microaggression, every suspicious look, every time someone had made her prove herself twice as hard for half the recognition. The tears came slowly at first. Just a shimmer in her eyes. Then one escaped, rolling down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but another followed. And another. Deborah Sterling, who had performed brain surgery on premature infants. Who had stood in operating rooms for 16 hours straight. Who had held the hands of parents while telling them their child would live. That Deborah Sterling was crying on an airplane because a flight attendant had taken her phone. But it wasn't about the phone. It was never about the phone. It was about being seen as less than. As suspicious. As someone who needed to be controlled, managed, put in her place. It was about her daughter watching this happen. Learning this lesson. Seeing her mother reduced to tears by someone drunk on the tiny amount of power they wielded. Naomi sat perfectly still beside her mother, watching those tears fall. And inside that 8-year-old girl's mind, something was happening. Something was calculating. Processing. Deciding. Let me tell you what was going through Naomi Sterling's head in that moment, because it's important. Because what happened next didn't come from nowhere. It came from something that had been building her entire young life. Naomi had always been observant. Hyper-aware. She noticed things other children missed. She'd noticed at age 5, that the saleswoman in the toy store followed her mother through the aisles but not the white mothers. She'd noticed at age 6 that when her mother called to make restaurant reservations she was told they were fully booked, but when her father called an hour later, suddenly tables were available. She'd noticed at age 7, that her mother kept emergency cash hidden in 3 different places in her purse, and when Naomi asked why, her mother had said, "Because sometimes, baby, you need to be able to prove you belong somewhere." Naomi had been learning her entire life that her mother, this brilliant, accomplished, kind woman, had to navigate a world that constantly questioned her right to exist in certain spaces. And now, at 35,000 feet, trapped in a metal tube hurtling through the sky, Naomi was watching her mother break. Not because she'd done anything wrong. but because someone had decided she didn't belong in business class. Someone had decided she needed to be taught a lesson. Someone had decided that power, even the small power of a flight attendant, was more important than human dignity. Naomi thought about her father, Barnabas Sterling, the man who'd built a technology empire from nothing, the man who'd taught her to code when she was 6, the man who'd told her over and over again, never let anyone make you small. Never let anyone diminish your mother. She's a queen. You come from queens. Naomi looked at her mother, tears streaming down her face, trying to hide them behind her hands. Trying to protect her daughter from seeing this. Failing. Then Naomi looked down the aisle toward the galley. Toward Lydia. And Naomi saw something that made her entire body tense. Lydia was at the galley counter, preparing drinks for other passengers. And there, sitting on the counter, just sitting there like it was a piece of garbage instead of medical equipment that could save a child's life, was her mother's phone. Lydia wasn't even guarding it. She just set it down. Triumphant. Done with it. Done with Deborah. Moving on to whatever small tyranny she'd enact next. Around them, other passengers were reacting. Priscilla, the silver-haired woman across the aisle, had her call button pressed. She was pressing it repeatedly, urgently, her face flushed with anger. "This is discrimination," Priscilla said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I'm calling for the supervisor. I've been flying for 50 years and I have never seen a flight attendant behave this way. This is racial profiling. This is harassment. And I'm not going to sit here and watch it happen." Silas, the lawyer, had his phone out, camera rolling, pointed down the aisle at Lydia. "I'm recording everything," he announced. "Every single interaction. Every word. This is wrong. This is discrimination and I'm documenting it all." Other passengers were murmuring now. Some were nodding in agreement. A few were pulling out their own phones. The cabin was transforming from a place of passive observation into something else. Something that felt like solidarity. But Naomi wasn't thinking about solidarity. She wasn't thinking about documentation or supervisor calls or anything else. She was thinking about her mother's face. About those tears. About the tremor in her mother's hands. She was thinking about queens. Naomi's small fingers moved to her seatbelt. She unbuckled it. The click was quiet, but in the tense silence of the cabin, it sounded loud. Deborah's head turned. She was still wiping tears from her eyes, trying to compose herself, trying to be strong for her daughter. "Baby, stay seated," Deborah said, her voice thick with emotion. Naomi looked at her mother. Really looked at her. And Deborah saw something in her daughter's eyes that she'd never quite seen before. A hardness. A determination. A steel core that Naomi had inherited from both her parents, forged in the fires of watching them navigate a world that didn't always welcome them. "I'll be right back, Mommy," Naomi said. Her voice was calm. Steady. The voice of someone 3 times her age. The voice of someone who'd made a decision and was now going to execute it with precision. Naomi stood up. All 4 feet 2 inches of her. Cornrows clicking with beads. Purple dress and white sneakers. A backpack almost as big as she was still sitting in her seat. She stepped into the aisle. And she started walking toward the galley. Every eye in business class followed her. Passengers stopped their conversations mid-sentence. People pulled out earbuds. The cabin went quiet in that particular way that happens when everyone knows something significant is about to occur but nobody knows quite what. Naomi walked with purpose. Not hurrying. Not hesitant. Just steady, measured steps. 1 foot in front of the other. Her small hands swinging naturally at her sides. Her chin up. Her shoulders back. Moving like someone who had every right to be exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing. She had watched her father walk into boardrooms full of people who doubted him. She had watched her mother walk into operating rooms where nurses questioned her authority. She had learned from both of them that confidence wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It was about knowing your worth and refusing to apologize for taking up space. So Naomi walked. Past row 3. Past row 2. Past row 1. She reached the galley. Lydia had her back turned, pouring orange juice into plastic cups. She was humming something under her breath. Satisfied. Content. Unaware that the 8-year-old girl she'd been indirectly tormenting for the past hour was now standing 6 feet behind her. Naomi stopped at the entrance to the galley, a space clearly marked with a sign that read "Crew only beyond this point." She cleared her throat. Deliberately. Loudly enough to be heard over the ambient noise of the aircraft. Lydia turned around and when she saw Naomi standing there, her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise first, eyebrows lifting. Then confusion, her head tilting slightly as if trying to understand why this child was in crew space. Then annoyance, her features hardening, her lips pressing together. "Little girl," Lydia said, her voice dripping with condescension, the way adults sometimes talk to children when they want to put them in their place. "Passengers aren't allowed back here. This is a crew-only area. Go back to your seat." She said it the way you might shoo away a stray dog. Dismissive. Annoyed at the interruption. Naomi didn't move. She stood her ground, feet planted, hands at her sides. She looked at Lydia with those intelligent, observant eyes. Then she looked past Lydia at the phone sitting on the counter. Then back at Lydia. "That's my mother's phone," Naomi said. Her voice was calm. Matter of fact. The voice of someone stating an obvious, undeniable truth. "She needs it for her patients. She's a doctor. A surgeon. Children need her help." The words were simple. Direct. No accusation in them. Just fact. Just truth. Lydia's face hardened further. She stepped slightly to the side, shifting her body to block Naomi's view of the phone, as if claiming ownership of it with her physical presence. "Your mother broke flight regulations," Lydia said, her voice getting sharper, more aggressive. "She was using her phone when she shouldn't have been. She'll get it back when we land. If she behaves appropriately. Now go back to your seat before I call the captain and have you both removed from this aircraft." The threat hung in the air like poison. Removed. As if an 8-year-old child was some kind of security risk. As if Naomi asking for her mother's phone back was somehow equivalent to a disturbance requiring pilot intervention. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying Lydia the way a scientist might study an interesting but ultimately flawed specimen under a microscope. "You've been mean to my mom this whole flight," Naomi said. Her voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it now. Something harder. "You keep bothering her. Making her put her tray table up when everyone else's is down. Making her sit up straight when everyone else is sleeping. Making her turn off her light when everyone else is reading. You don't bother anyone else. Just her. Why is that?" The question landed like a punch. Several passengers who'd moved closer to hear the exchange inhaled sharply. Silas, still recording, adjusted his angle to make sure he was capturing both Naomi's and Lydia's faces. Lydia's face flushed dark red. Her hands clenched at her sides. "I don't have to explain myself to a child," she said, her voice rising. "I enforce regulations equally for all passengers. Now go sit down before you get yourself and your mother in even more trouble than you're already in." "My mom didn't do anything wrong," Naomi said. She took one small step forward. Not aggressive. Just closing the distance. Making herself harder to dismiss. "Everyone else has their phones out right now. I can see them. Everyone else has their tray tables down. Everyone else is sitting back in their seats. But you only care about my mom. You only keep coming back to our row. You only keep checking on her. That's not about rules. That's about something else." The accusation, unspoken but crystal clear, hung between them. The passengers who could hear this exchange were leaning forward now, straining to catch every word. A few had moved into the aisle, ostensibly to stretch their legs, but really to get closer to the confrontation unfolding at the galley. Lydia's jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscles jumping in her cheeks. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From rage. From the audacity of this child, this black child, questioning her authority, her motivations, her professionalism. "Go. Back. Your seat," Lydia said, enunciating each word like a separate sentence. "Right. Now." Naomi looked at the phone again. It was just sitting there. Right there on the counter, maybe 3 feet away from where she stood. Her mother's phone. Her mother's lifeline to her patients. Her mother's dignity sitting there like it was trash, like it was contraband, like it was something Lydia had won as a trophy. Naomi thought about the 6-year-old who needed her mother's medical expertise. She thought about her mother's tears. She thought about her father's words echoing in her head. "Never let anyone diminish your mother. She's a queen." And Naomi made her decision. She stepped forward, quick and decisive, and before Lydia could react, before the flight attendant's brain could process what was happening and send signals to her muscles to stop it, Naomi reached past her and grabbed her mother's phone off the counter. Her small fingers closed around it. Secure. Firm. "Hey." Lydia's voice was a shriek now, high-pitched and shocked. She lunged forward, her hand reaching out to grab either the phone or Naomi or both, but Naomi was already stepping back, already moving out of range, the phone clutched securely in her hand. "You can't just give that back. You just stole that phone. That's theft. Do you understand what you just did? That's theft." "It's my mom's phone," Naomi said. She was backing away now but not running. Not scared. Just creating distance, putting space between herself and Lydia's grasping hands. Her voice remained steady, calm, factual. You took it from her. You had no right to take it. I'm giving it back to her. That's not theft. That's returning stolen property. Lydia's face had gone from red to purple, a deep, unhealthy color that suggested her blood pressure had just spiked to dangerous levels. That is theft, she screamed. That is, I confiscated that phone for violating regulations. I will have you arrested when we land. Do you understand me? You and your mother will both be arrested. The police will be waiting at the gate. You'll both be in handcuffs. The threats came pouring out, each one more hysterical than the last. Lydia was losing control completely now, her professional veneer cracking and shattering, revealing something ugly underneath. The cabin was absolutely silent now. Not a single conversation happening. Not a single person looking at their screen or their book. Every passenger in business class was watching. Many had stood up from their seats to see better. Others were leaning far into the aisles, craning their necks. Some had their phones out, recording. The moment had crystallized into something electric, charged, dangerous. This was the moment. The fulcrum. The point where everything would either explode or resolve. Naomi turned around. Slowly. Deliberately. She turned to face not just Lydia but the entire cabin. To face all those watching passengers. To face her mother, who was half standing from her seat now, one hand gripping the headrest in front of her, the other hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear and something else. Something that might have been pride. Or terror. Or both swirled together into something new. And then Naomi spoke. Her voice carried through the cabin, clear and steady and strong, with an authority that should have been impossible for someone who still lost teeth and believed in the tooth fairy. But Naomi wasn't speaking like an 8-year-old in that moment. She was speaking like her father's daughter. Like her mother's protector. Like someone who had watched injustice unfold for long enough and had decided, simply, that it was time for it to stop. My billionaire dad would end your career if you do this again. The words landed like explosions. Like sonic booms. Like lightning strikes in the confined space of the aircraft cabin. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Passengers gasped, loud and shocked. Someone dropped their phone and it clattered to the floor. Another person choked on their drink, coughing. A woman in row 2 said, "Oh my God," loud enough for everyone to hear. A man in row 5 whispered, "Did she just say what I think she said?" Lydia froze. Completely froze. Her entire body went rigid, her hand still extended toward Naomi as if she could somehow reach through time and space and take back the last 30 seconds and make them not have happened. Her mouth hung open. Her eyes went wide. Her face, which had been purple with rage, started to drain of color. But Naomi wasn't done. She took one step forward. Not toward Lydia. Toward the watching cabin. Toward the audience that had formed. Her voice dropped lower, becoming even more serious, more adult, more absolutely, terrifyingly certain. "Touch my mom one more time and find out." The threat was simple. 7 words. But those 7 words contained multitudes. They contained the full weight of wealth and power and consequence. They contained the promise of lawsuits and media coverage and career destruction. They contained everything that Lydia had ignored in her rush to exercise her petty authority over a woman she judged unworthy of business class. Dead silence. Not a single person moved. Not a single person breathed. The airplane engines hummed in the background, that constant white noise that you stopped noticing after a while, but inside the cabin there was nothing. Just shocked, absolute, complete silence. The kind of silence that happens after an explosion, when everyone's ears are ringing and their brains are trying to process what just happened. Lydia's face went through a remarkable transformation. The purple flush drained away like water circling a drain, leaving her pale. Then gray. Then almost white, the color of old paper or bone. Her eyes widened even further, whites showing all around the irises. Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish pulled from water and desperately gasping for oxygen that wouldn't come. Her hand, still extended, began to tremble. Then her whole arm. Then her whole body. Because here's what Lydia was realizing in that moment, what was crashing down on her like a building collapsing. She had been so caught up in her power trip, so focused on putting Deborah in her place, so certain of her authority and her righteousness and her right to enforce whatever standards she deemed appropriate, that she had never once, not for a single second, considered who these people might actually be. She had seen a black woman and her daughter in business class and she had made assumptions. Made calculations. Made judgments. She had decided, based on nothing but the color of their skin, that they probably didn't belong there. That they'd probably gotten upgraded by mistake. That they probably needed to be watched closely, controlled, managed, kept in line. She had decided to make Deborah Sterling's flight miserable. She had decided to exercise every tiny bit of power her position afforded her. She had decided that these were people who couldn't fight back, who wouldn't dare cause a scene, who would just accept whatever treatment she doled out. And those decisions, made in prejudice and malice and casual cruelty, might have just destroyed her entire career. Because billionaire dad wasn't a child's fantasy or an empty threat. Naomi Sterling had just dropped a bomb that was going to explode spectacularly the moment they touched down in Seattle. Maybe before then. Maybe the moment cell service kicked back in and passengers started making phone calls and posting videos and sending emails. Lydia could see her future unraveling in real time. She could see the viral videos, the news coverage, the internal investigation, the termination letter, the unemployability in the airline industry, the reputation destroyed beyond repair. All of it because she couldn't keep her prejudices in check for a 5-hour flight. Naomi held her gaze for another long moment. Then she turned and walked back down the aisle. She moved through the silent cabin like a warrior returning from battle, phone clutched in her small hand. Passengers stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to absolute, utter disbelief. Some looked like they wanted to applaud. Others looked scared, like they'd just witnessed something that they weren't supposed to see. A few looked at Naomi like she was some kind of supernatural being, not quite human, certainly not quite child. When Naomi reached row 4, she stopped in front of her mother. Deborah was fully standing now, tears streaming down her face, hands still over her mouth. She was trembling, staring at her daughter like she'd never quite seen her before. Like the child she'd given birth to 8 years ago had somehow transformed into something new right before her eyes. "Here, Mommy," Naomi said, and her voice was gentle now, childlike again. Sweet and soft and completely normal, as if she hadn't just delivered one of the most devastating verbal takedowns in aviation history. As if she hadn't just threatened a grown woman's career with 7 simple words. "You need this for your patients." She held out the phone. Deborah took it with shaking hands. She stared at it for a moment, then at her daughter, then back at the phone. Then she dropped to her knees right there in the aisle, not caring that passengers were watching, not caring about anything except wrapping her arms around her child and pulling her close. Deborah held Naomi tight, so tight the little girl squeaked slightly. And Deborah whispered something into her daughter's ear, something that only Naomi could hear, something that made the little girl's eyes fill with tears and her arms squeeze even tighter around her mother's neck. Whatever it was, Naomi nodded against her mother's shoulder. Then, from somewhere in the back of the cabin, someone started clapping. Just one person at first. Slow claps. Deliberate. Then another person joined in. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire business class section was applauding, and the sound was thunderous in the enclosed space. Some passengers were standing. Some were wiping tears from their own eyes. Some were laughing in that particular way people laugh when tension finally breaks, when justice finally arrives, when the underdog finally wins. The applause went on for 30 seconds. 45. A full minute. People were cheering now. Someone whistled. Someone else shouted, "You tell her, baby girl." Another voice called out, "Good for you, honey." Lydia stood in the galley, frozen like a statue, watching this happen. Watching an 8-year-old child receive a standing ovation for publicly, thoroughly, completely humiliating her. Watching her authority, her power, her control evaporate like morning mist under sunlight. Watching 15 years of her career circle the drain because she couldn't control her prejudices for one single flight. And in that moment, Lydia Hartwell knew with absolute certainty that her life as she knew it was over. She knew that somewhere on this plane, probably multiple someones, had recorded everything. The harassment. The phone confiscation. Naomi's confrontation. Her threats of arrest. All of it, documented, time-stamped, ready to be uploaded the second they landed. She knew that billionaire dad wasn't an 8-year-old's fantasy. She knew that Barnabas Sterling was probably exactly who Naomi said he was, and that he almost certainly had lawyers on retainer who would love nothing more than to make an example of an airline employee who had racially profiled and harassed his wife. She knew that by tomorrow, maybe by tonight, she would be a trending topic. A viral video. A cautionary tale. The face of everything wrong with how black passengers are treated on airlines. She also knew, deep in her bones, that she had brought every single bit of it on herself. Priscilla was still pressing her call button, the light flashing insistently above her seat. Silas was still recording, his phone camera still pointed toward the galley. Other passengers had their phones out too, some recording, some typing furiously, probably posting to social media, texting friends, sharing what they just witnessed in real time. Deborah and Naomi sat back down in their seats. Deborah buckled Naomi's seatbelt with hands that were still shaking. She checked her phone, saw the messages from the hospital, and quickly typed responses with trembling fingers. The urgent message about her post-op patient. The guidance that child needed. She could do that now. She could be the doctor she trained so hard to become. Naomi picked up her molecular biology textbook and opened it to where she'd left off. She found her page. Adjusted her reading light, which was still off because Lydia had made her turn it off. She clicked it back on. Deliberately. Making a point. Nobody said a word. Naomi started reading, her small finger tracing the lines of text, her cornrows clicking softly as she tilted her head to study a diagram. Like she'd just done the most normal thing in the world. Like she hadn't just changed the entire trajectory of this flight. Like she was just an 8-year-old girl who loved her mother and wouldn't stand by while someone hurt her. Because that's exactly what she was. The applause finally died down. Passengers settled back into their seats. But the energy in the cabin had fundamentally changed. There was a solidarity now. A shared experience. Everyone who had witnessed what just happened was bonded by it, connected by having seen injustice confronted and defeated by the smallest, most unlikely hero imaginable. People kept glancing at Naomi. At Deborah. At the galley where Lydia stood, still frozen, still pale, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. And somewhere in the cockpit, a call button was flashing. Priscilla's call button, which she'd been pressing for the last 10 minutes. A supervisor was needed. And he was on his way. If you're not subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button right now because this story is far from over. What happens when the cabin supervisor arrives and realizes who he's dealing with? You're not going to believe it. And here's my question for you. Do you think Naomi did the right thing? Should an 8-year-old have taken matters into her own hands, or should she have stayed in her seat and let the adults handle it? Drop your answer in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think. But we need to get back to Flight 847. Because while Naomi is calmly reading her textbook and Deborah is messaging her hospital and Lydia is having what might be a nervous breakdown in the galley, someone very important is walking down that aisle. The cabin supervisor. Philip Castellanos. 15 years with the airline. Professional. Fair. By the book. And when he finds out who he's dealing with, when he sees the video that Silas has recorded, when he learns that Barnabas Sterling's wife and daughter have just been subjected to systematic harassment for the last hour, everything is about to change. The applause was still echoing through the cabin when Lydia finally found her voice again. Are you threatening me? Her voice came out as a sputter, half-strangled, barely controlled. She was staring at Naomi's retreating back, at this 8-year-old child who had just publicly humiliated her in front of an entire cabin full of witnesses. Are you threatening me? A child is threatening me? She said it louder now, her voice rising in pitch and volume, trying to regain some control, some authority, some sense that she was still the one in charge here. But it didn't work. It just made her sound desperate. Hysterical. Like someone grasping at straws while drowning. Several passengers stopped clapping. Not because they agreed with Lydia. But because they were watching her unravel in real time and it was uncomfortable. Like watching a building collapse. You can't look away but you don't feel good about watching it either. Lydia's hands were shaking as she reached for the intercom panel. She pressed the button with more force than necessary, and when she spoke, her voice was trembling with barely suppressed emotion. Philip, I need you in business class immediately. We have a situation. A passenger situation. It's urgent. She released the button and stood there, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her face was still pale, but red splotches were appearing on her cheeks and neck. Anger and humiliation, mixing together into something toxic. Down the aisle, Naomi had reached row 4. She stood in front of her mother, holding out the phone like an offering. Like a knight returning from battle with a captured prize. Deborah was still on her knees in the aisle, and when Naomi handed her the phone, Deborah took it with hands that trembled so badly she almost dropped it. She stared at the phone, then at her daughter, then back at the phone like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. Naomi, Deborah said, her voice thick with emotion, what did you? She couldn't even finish the question. What did you do? What were you thinking? How did you find the courage? Where did those words come from? All of those questions swirling in her mind, but she couldn't get any of them out. Naomi looked at her mother with those serious, intelligent eyes. Eyes that seemed far too old for an 8-year-old face. Nobody treats my mommy that way, Naomi said. Her voice was quiet but firm. Absolute in its certainty. Nobody. And with those two words, Deborah broke. She pulled Naomi into her arms and held her so tight that Naomi made a small squeaking sound. Deborah was crying fully now, not trying to hide it, not trying to be strong or composed or professional. Just crying. Releasing an hour of accumulated tension and humiliation and pain and now, somehow, pride. The passengers who had been clapping started again. Harder this time. More enthusiastic. Someone in row 6 shouted, "You tell him, little girl." A woman in row 2 was crying too, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. A man across the aisle gave Naomi a thumbs up. Priscilla leaned across the aisle, her silver hair catching the overhead lights, her eyes bright with emotion. "Good for you, sweetheart," she said to Naomi. Her voice was warm but also fierce, like a grandmother protecting her grandchild. "Good for you." That woman needed to hear exactly what you told her. Naomi nodded solemnly, accepting the praise but not quite smiling. She understood, in that way that precocious children sometimes do, that what had just happened was significant. Important. But also serious. Not really something to celebrate even though people were applauding. Deborah finally released her daughter and stood up, helping Naomi back into her seat and buckling her seatbelt. Her hands were still shaking. She checked her phone, saw the messages from the hospital, and her surgeon brain kicked back in. She started typing responses, giving medical guidance, being the doctor her patient needed. But her eyes kept flicking to her daughter, like she couldn't quite believe what Naomi had done. The cabin was settling back down now, the applause fading, conversations resuming, but with a different energy. People were talking about what they just witnessed. Sharing observations. A few were already on their phones, typing rapidly. Within minutes, the first social media posts would go live. Hashtags would be created. The video Silas had recorded would start making the rounds. But right now in this moment there was a brief calm. A pause before the next wave hit. That pause lasted about 90 seconds. Then Philip Castellanos appeared at the front of business class. Philip was 38 years old, originally from Ecuador, with dark hair going gray at the temples and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been with the airline for 15 years, working his way up from gate agent to flight attendant to cabin supervisor. He was known for being fair, professional, and unflappable. He'd handled medical emergencies, unruly passengers, mechanical issues, and just about every other crisis you could encounter at 35,000 feet. But he'd never handled anything quite like this. He walked down the aisle with purposeful strides, his expression serious and concerned. He'd heard the urgency in Lydia's voice. He knew something significant had happened. But he didn't know what yet. Lydia was waiting for him at the galley, and the moment he got close enough, she started talking. Fast. Defensive. Her version of events tumbling out in a rush. "Philip, thank God. We have a serious situation. That child," she pointed down the aisle toward Naomi, "stole property that I had confiscated from her mother for violating FAA regulations. She came back to the galley, reached past me and took the phone. That's theft. Then she threatened me. She said her father would end my career. She's 8 years old and she's making threats. The mother has been non-compliant all flight. Refusing to follow instructions. Using her phone during flight. I had to confiscate it for safety reasons. And then her daughter assaulted me and stole it back." The words came out so fast Philip had to mentally replay them to make sure he'd heard correctly. He held up one hand, a gesture asking her to slow down, to breathe. "Okay," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Let me talk to the passengers involved. Stay here." He walked down the aisle toward row 4, and as he approached, he could see the aftermath of whatever had happened. Deborah was in her seat, phone in hand, typing rapidly. Her eyes were red. Tear tracks visible on her cheeks. Naomi was beside her, reading a textbook that looked far too advanced for a child her age. Philip stopped at their row and took a breath, composing his approach. "Ma'am," he said to Deborah, his voice professional but kind, "I'm Philip Castellanos, the cabin supervisor. I apologize for the disturbance. May I understand what happened here?" Deborah looked up at him. She studied his face for a moment, probably trying to determine if he was another Lydia or if he was actually interested in the truth. She must have seen something in his expression that satisfied her, because she set down her phone and took a breath. But when she spoke, her voice was flat. Exhausted. Done. "I just want to get to Seattle," she said. "That's all I want. To get to Seattle, see my husband, and forget this flight ever happened." Philip's eyebrows drew together. That wasn't the response he'd expected. Not defensive. Not angry. Just tired. Defeated. And something about that tiredness told him more than any explanation could have. Before he could respond, Silas stood up from his seat across the aisle. He held up his phone. "Sir, I recorded the last hour. Everything that happened. You need to see this." Philip turned to look at Silas, and there was something in the lawyer's expression that made Philip's stomach sink. Whatever was on that video, it wasn't good. "May I?" Philip asked. Silas nodded and handed over his phone. Philip took it and pressed play. For the next several minutes, Philip Castellanos watched his colleague systematically harass a passenger. He watched Lydia target Deborah again and again. The tray table incident. The seat position. The carry-on bag. The reading light. He watched other passengers with their tray tables down, their seats reclined, their reading lights on. He watched Lydia ignore all of them and focus exclusively on Deborah. He watched the phone confrontation. Deborah explaining she needed it for her hospital. Lydia demanding she hand it over. The threat of having her removed from the aircraft. He watched 8-year-old Naomi walk to the galley. Watched her calmly take her mother's phone. Watched her deliver that line about her billionaire father. Philip's expression changed as he watched. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. His face went from concern to angry to horrified. He was watching his airline's liability increase with every second of footage. He was watching a discrimination lawsuit being created in real time. He was watching a PR nightmare unfold. When the video ended, Philip stood there for a moment, just breathing. Processing. Then he handed the phone back to Silas. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll need a copy of that sent to our corporate office." "Already done," Silas said. "Sent it to my email the moment the confrontation ended." Philip nodded. Then he turned and walked back toward the galley. His stride was different now. Faster. Harder. The walk of someone who was about to have a very unpleasant conversation. When he reached the galley, Lydia looked at him expectantly. Waiting for validation. Waiting for him to tell her she'd done the right thing. Waiting for him to back her up. "Miss Hartwell," Philip said, his voice low and cold. "Galley. Now." The way he said it made several nearby passengers look up. There was no warmth in his tone. No collegiality. Just authority and barely controlled anger. Lydia followed him into the galley area, and Philip stepped close to her, speaking in a voice that was quiet but intense. "I just watched video of the last hour. Every interaction you had with Dr. Sterling. Every single one. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Lydia's face went from defensive to uncertain. "I was enforcing regulations." "You were racially profiling a passenger," Philip said, cutting her off. "I watched you ignore a dozen people violating the same regulations while you targeted one woman. I watched you confiscate her phone while 6 other passengers had theirs out. I watched you create a hostile environment and then escalate it when her child tried to help. Do you have any concept of the liability you've just created?" Lydia opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No words came out. Before Philip could continue, Priscilla's voice carried across the cabin. She'd been listening, and she'd decided it was time to add another piece of information to the mix. "And you should know," Priscilla called out, her voice strong and clear despite her age, "that child's father is Barnabas Sterling." Philip turned to look at her. The name registered, but he wanted confirmation. "The Barnabas Sterling?" he asked. "Sterling Tech." "The very same," Priscilla said. She was smiling now, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone watching justice arrive. "The billionaire. The one who donated $50 million to children's hospitals last year. The one who testified before Congress about data privacy. That Barnabas Sterling. His wife is Dr. Deborah Sterling, the pediatric surgeon your colleague has been harassing for the past hour." Philip's face went pale. Then gray. He turned back to Lydia, and whatever he saw in his expression made her take a step backward. "You're suspended," Philip said. "Effective immediately. You'll remain in the galley for the rest of the flight. When we land, you'll be escorted off the aircraft by security. You're not to interact with passengers. You're not to speak to anyone except me. Do you understand?" Lydia's world collapsed in that moment. You could see it happening. Her face crumpled. Her shoulders sagged. Her hands started trembling. "Philip, please, I was just—" "Do you understand?" Philip repeated. His voice was harder now. "Final." Lydia nodded. She couldn't speak. Tears were forming in her eyes, but Philip had no sympathy for her. Not after what he'd just watched. Philip turned and walked back to row 4. He stopped in front of Deborah and Naomi, and this time when he spoke his voice was completely different. Formal. Apologetic. The voice of someone representing an organization that had failed catastrophically. Dr. Sterling, he said, and the fact that he used her title was significant, acknowledging her professional standing that Lydia had ignored. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what you and your daughter experienced on this flight. The behavior you were subjected to is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of this airline. Ms. Hartwell has been suspended effective immediately. She will be escorted off the aircraft when we land, and there will be a full investigation into her conduct. Deborah looked at him. Really looked at him. Searching his face for sincerity or just more corporate damage control. I don't want your apologies, she said finally. Her voice was quiet but firm. I just want to be treated like everyone else. Like a human being who paid for a ticket and deserves basic respect. That's all. That's all any of us want. Philip nodded. You're absolutely right. And I'm ashamed that we failed to provide that. He took a breath, preparing his next offer. I'd like to upgrade you and your daughter to first class for the remainder of the flight. And I'll personally ensure that you receive complimentary flights for the next year. It's the least we can do. Deborah shook her head. Not angrily. Just tired. Keep your perks, she said. I don't want upgrades or free flights. I want you to train your staff better. I want them to examine their biases. I want the next black woman who boards this airline to have a different experience than I had. That's what I want. The words landed like hammer blows. Each one precise. Each one true. Each one damning. Philip nodded slowly. I understand. And I will personally make sure your feedback reaches our executive team. Will you? Deborah asked. Or will this become another complaint that gets filed away and forgotten? I will, Philip said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he meant it. You have my word. This will not be forgotten. Naomi, who had been quiet through this entire exchange, finally spoke up. My daddy says words are easy. Actions are what matter. Philip looked down at this 8-year-old girl who had already taught several adults important lessons today. Your daddy is right, he said. And I promise you there will be action. Real action. He straightened up, preparing to leave, but then he paused. For what it's worth, he said, looking at Naomi, what you did took courage. You stood up for your mother when the adults around you failed to. That's remarkable. Naomi didn't smile. She just nodded, accepting the statement as fact rather than praise. Philip walked back toward the galley, and as he passed Lydia, who was standing there with tears streaming down her face, mascara running, her 15-year career crumbling around her, he didn't even look at her. Lydia had to walk through the cabin to reach the aft galley where she'd been ordered to stay. That walk was the longest of her life. She had to pass every passenger who had witnessed her behavior. Had to see their faces. Had to feel their judgment. Some passengers glared at her. Others looked away, uncomfortable. A few shook their heads in disgust. One woman actually said, "Shame on you," as Lydia passed. When Lydia walked past row 4, she kept her eyes straight ahead. She couldn't look at Deborah. Couldn't look at Naomi. Couldn't face the evidence of what she'd done. Her face was full of humiliation, red and splotchy, tears still falling. She looked small somehow. Diminished. The power she'd wielded so carelessly an hour ago had evaporated, and now she was just a woman facing the consequences of her choices. Naomi watched her walk past. Deborah held her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. The cabin settled back into an uneasy quiet. Passengers were processing what they'd witnessed. Some were still typing on their phones. Others were talking in low voices. The energy had shifted from shock to something else. Satisfaction, maybe. Justice, hopefully. Deborah went back to her phone, responding to the hospital, checking on her patient, being the doctor she'd trained so hard to become. But every few seconds she'd glance at her daughter, this remarkable little person who had stood up when Deborah couldn't anymore. Naomi went back to her molecular biology textbook. Back to learning about cellular processes and protein synthesis. Back to being an 8-year-old girl who loved science and reading and her parents. But something had changed. Both Deborah and Naomi knew it. Something fundamental had shifted during this flight. Naomi had learned that sometimes you have to fight back. Sometimes kindness isn't enough. Sometimes you have to stand up and say, enough, and mean it. And Deborah had learned that her daughter was stronger than she'd realized. That the lessons she and Barnabas had been teaching Naomi about dignity and worth and standing up for yourself had taken root. Had grown into something powerful. The flight continued. The minutes ticked by. Seattle got closer. And in the back galley, Lydia sat on a jump seat, staring at nothing, wondering how her day had gone so catastrophically wrong. Wondering how a routine flight had turned into a career-ending disaster. Wondering if she'd ever work in aviation again. knowing deep down that the answer was probably no. All because she couldn't see past her prejudices. All because she'd decided that a black woman and her daughter didn't belong in business class. All because she'd wielded her small amount of power like a weapon instead of a responsibility. And an 8-year-old girl had ended her career with 7 words. Touch my mom one more time and find out. Lydia would replay those words for years. In the unemployment line. In job interviews that would go nowhere once potential employers Googled her name. In the quiet moments before sleep when regret hit hardest. 7 words that changed everything. If this story has moved you, if you believe in standing up against injustice no matter how small or how young you are, hit that subscribe button. Because we're almost at the end of this journey, but the most powerful part is still to come. And here's my question. Do you think Lydia deserved what happened to her, or was the punishment too harsh? Was losing her career over one flight fair? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this is the kind of question that doesn't have an easy answer. But right now we need to get back to Flight 847. Because we're about to land in Seattle. And waiting at that gate is Barnabas Sterling. The billionaire. The father. The husband. And when he sees his wife's face, when he hears what happened, when his daughter tells him the story, the aftermath is just beginning. Flight 847 began its descent into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at exactly 4:47 p.m. Pacific Time. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and professional, announcing they'd be landing in approximately 15 minutes and asking the flight attendants to prepare the cabin. But the cabin was already prepared. Had been for a while now. Ever since the confrontation. Ever since Naomi Sterling had walked back from the galley with her mother's phone and 7 words that had changed everything. The passengers in business class had spent the last hour and a half in an unusual state. Some had tried to go back to their work, their books, their movies, but everyone was distracted. Everyone kept glancing at row 4, where Deborah was typing on her phone and Naomi was reading her textbook. Everyone kept glancing toward the back, where Lydia sat in isolation, her career imploding around her. Some passengers had spent the time on their phones, uploading videos, writing posts, texting friends and family. You won't believe what just happened on my flight. I just witnessed the most incredible thing. An 8-year-old just took down a racist flight attendant and it was beautiful. The video Silas had recorded was already making the rounds in private messages and group chats. By the time they landed, it would be on Twitter. Within hours, it would be on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Within a day, news outlets would be calling. Within a week, everyone would know the name Naomi Sterling. But right now, in this moment, they were just coming home. The wheels touched down with that characteristic thump and screech. The engines roared in reverse thrust. The plane slowed, turned, taxied toward the gate. Normal landing procedures. Routine. Except nothing about this flight had been routine. When the plane finally stopped at gate C11 and the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers stood up with an eagerness that had nothing to do with wanting to get off the plane and everything to do with wanting to escape the tension that had filled the cabin for hours. But before anyone could grab their luggage, Philip's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for flying with us today. I also want to apologize for any disturbance you may have experienced during the flight. Please know that we take all passenger concerns seriously, and appropriate action has been taken. We appreciate your patience and understanding. For those passengers who witnessed or were affected by today's incident, please see me before deplaning if you'd like to provide a formal statement. Thank you again for your patience. It was a carefully worded statement. Professional. Corporate. But everyone knew what he was really saying. Yes, what you saw happened. Yes, we're dealing with it. Yes, we know this was serious. The passengers began to deplane. Many of them stopped at row 4 to say something to Deborah and Naomi. A woman squeezed Deborah's shoulder and said, "You handled that with such grace." A man told Naomi, "You're going to be an amazing woman someday. You already are." Priscilla gave them both her business card and said, "If you ever need anything at all, you call me." Silas handed Deborah his card as well. "I'm a lawyer. If you decide to pursue action against the airline, I'll represent you pro bono. And I mean that." Deborah thanked them all, gracious even in exhaustion, even after everything. Naomi accepted the praise with quiet dignity, like a soldier receiving medals after battle. They waited until most of the cabin had cleared before gathering their things. Deborah's hands were steadier now. The crying had stopped. She texted Barnabas during the descent, a simple message, "We're fine. Long story. See you at the gate." His response had been immediate, "I'm here. Waiting for you. Always waiting for you." They walked up the jetway, Deborah holding Naomi's hand. As they emerged into the gate area, Deborah's eyes scanned the crowd, looking for her husband, her anchor. The man who would understand, who would be furious on her behalf, who would want to fix everything. She found him standing near the windows, and even after everything that had happened, the sight of him made her breath catch slightly. Barnabas Sterling didn't look like a billionaire. That was the first thing people always noticed about him. He was wearing jeans and a Stanford hoodie, scuffed sneakers, a baseball cap. No designer labels. No flashy watch. No entourage. Just a man waiting for his family. He was tall, with dark skin and an athletic build that came from actually using the home gym he'd installed, not from having a personal trainer for show. His eyes, warm and intelligent behind simple wire-rimmed glasses, were scanning the deplaning passengers, looking for his wife and daughter. When he saw them, his face transformed. That smile. That genuine, warm, reaching all the way to his eyes smile that had made Deborah fall in love with him 13 years ago. He started walking toward them. Naomi saw him and her composure finally cracked. The 8-year-old who had faced down a grown woman and delivered devastating one-liners became a child again. She dropped her mother's hand and ran. "Daddy." Barnabas dropped to one knee and caught her as she launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his neck and holding tight. He lifted her up, standing, spinning her around once like he always did, and Naomi laughed. The first real laugh she'd made in hours. "There's my brilliant girl," Barnabas said, setting her back down but keeping his hands on her shoulders, studying her face. "Did you have a good flight?" And Naomi, looking up at her father with those serious eyes, said something that made Barnabas's smile falter. "Daddy, I used your name." Barnabas blinked, confused. He looked past Naomi to Deborah, who had reached them now, and he saw something in his wife's face that made his whole body tense. Her eyes were red. Her face was drawn. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Deb? What happened?" Deborah took a breath. And right there in the terminal, with travelers rushing past and announcements echoing overhead and the normal chaos of an airport swirling around them, she told him everything. She told him about Lydia's immediate coldness at boarding. About the ticket verification that took too long. About the tray table and the seat position and the carry-on bag and the reading light. About being singled out, targeted, harassed for an hour while other passengers were ignored. About the urgent text from the hospital and needing her phone. About Lydia confiscating it, taking it away, threatening arrest. She told him about breaking down. About crying in her seat. About feeling defeated and humiliated and small. And then she told him about Naomi. About their daughter unbuckling her seatbelt and walking to the galley. About Naomi taking the phone back. About the words that came out of their 8-year-old's mouth. "My billionaire dad would end your career if you do this again. Touch my mom one more time and find out." Barnabas's expression went through several transformations as he listened. Confusion became concern. Concern became anger. Anger became something harder. Colder. The face he wore in boardrooms when someone tried to cheat him. The face he wore when protecting something precious. But when Deborah finished, when she told him about the standing ovation and Philip's response and Lydia's suspension, Barnabas's expression softened. He looked down at Naomi, who was watching him carefully, trying to gauge whether she was in trouble. Barnabas knelt down again, bringing himself to eye level with his daughter. "Naomi," he said quietly, "you protected your mother. You stood up when adults around you failed to. You were brave and strong and fierce. I'm proud of you. So incredibly proud." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. Relief maybe. Or just the release of tension she'd been holding for hours. But Barnabas wasn't done. "But baby girl, I need you to understand something. Your mother doesn't need my name to deserve respect. She doesn't need my money or my company or anything I've built. She deserves respect because she's a human being. Because she's brilliant and kind and accomplished. Because she saves children's lives. She deserves respect because of who she is, not because of who she married." Naomi nodded, understanding the lesson he was teaching. But then she said something that made both her parents' hearts squeeze. "I know that, Daddy. I do." But they didn't know that. They saw Mommy's face and decided she didn't belong. They were never going to treat her right, no matter how nice she was, no matter how many lives she saved. So I made them understand that they messed with the wrong family. Sometimes people need to know there will be consequences before they'll do the right thing. Barnabas stared at his daughter. This 8-year-old child who had somehow articulated a truth that many adults never learned. That dignity should be freely given but sometimes has to be demanded. That justice should be automatic but sometimes requires force. He pulled her into another hug, and this time he held her for a long moment, his hand cradling the back of her head with her cornrows and beads clicking softly. "You're right," he whispered into her hair. "You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you had to learn that lesson so young. I'm sorry that you had to fight when you should have been safe. I'm sorry that the world isn't what it should be." "It's okay, Daddy," Naomi said. "Mommy taught me that we can't control how other people behave. Only how we respond." Barnabas released her and stood, turning to Deborah. He pulled his wife into his arms, and Deborah finally let herself break again. She sobbed into his chest, months or maybe years of holding it together finally releasing. All the time she'd been followed in stores. All the time she'd been mistaken for a nurse instead of a surgeon. All the time she'd had to smile and stay professional while being disrespected. All of it came pouring out. "You're okay," Barnabas murmured into her hair. "I've got you. You're safe. You're home." After a long moment, Deborah pulled back, wiping her eyes, composing herself. "Our daughter is fierce," she said, and there was pride in her voice now. Not just pain. Pride. "She gets it from her mother," Barnabas said. "And her father," Deborah replied. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, a family united, stronger somehow for what they'd been through. Then Barnabas picked up their luggage, Deborah took Naomi's hand and they walked toward the exit. But this wasn't the end of the story. Not really. Because what happened on Flight 847 didn't stay on Flight 847. 1 week later, the ripples of that confrontation had spread far beyond that airplane cabin. The video that Silas recorded went viral within 24 hours. It started on Twitter, where a passenger who'd witnessed the event posted a thread describing what happened. Silas's video was attached. Within hours it had 1 million views. By the end of the week, it had been seen by more than 50 million people worldwide. The hashtag Naomi Sterling trended for 3 days. So did hashtag flight attendant Lydia and hashtag racial profiling in the air. News outlets picked up the story. CNN ran a segment. The New York Times wrote an op-ed about discrimination in air travel. The Washington Post interviewed aviation industry experts about training and oversight. NPR did a whole feature on the experience of black travelers. Lydia Hartwell was terminated. But that was just the beginning. The airline's internal investigation, triggered by the incident and accelerated by the viral video and media attention, revealed a pattern. Other passengers came forward. Other black women who'd flown with Lydia and experienced similar treatment. Other complaints that had been filed and dismissed or minimized. Lydia hadn't just targeted Deborah. Deborah was just the one time she got caught. The one time she picked the wrong family. The one time her victim had a daughter brave enough to fight back and passengers willing to document and speak up. The airline's CEO issued a public apology. Not a corporate non-apology but an actual apology. They announced mandatory bias training for all flight attendants. They created a new passenger advocacy office. They updated their complaint procedures. They made Deborah and Naomi's experience into a catalyst for change. It wouldn't fix everything. One incident, one viral video, one terminated employee couldn't undo decades of systemic problems in the airline industry or society at large. But it was something. It was a start. Priscilla, the silver-haired woman who'd sat across the aisle, wrote a letter to the airline CEO. 5 pages, single-spaced, detailing everything she'd witnessed. She sent copies to the board of directors, to the FAA, to the media. She ended the letter with a paragraph about Naomi that got quoted in several news articles. "In my 71 years, I've seen courage take many forms. But I've rarely seen it as pure and powerful as what I witnessed from 8-year-old Naomi Sterling." She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for adults to fix the problem. She saw her mother hurting and she acted. With clarity and conviction that many adults lack, she stood up and said, "Enough. We should all be so brave. We should all be so clear about right and wrong. We should all love our mothers with that kind of fierce, protective devotion." The letter went viral too. Priscilla appeared on several morning shows, telling Naomi's story, advocating for change in the industry. Silas, the lawyer who'd recorded everything, did end up representing Deborah. Not in a lawsuit though. Deborah didn't want money or revenge. She wanted change. So Silas helped her work with the airline to develop new training protocols. New procedures for handling discrimination complaints. New accountability measures for crew members. The work was ongoing. Would probably be ongoing for years. But it was happening. Deborah returned to Emory Children's Hospital the Monday after the incident. Her post-op patient, the 6-year-old with the appendix, was recovering beautifully. Deborah walked into the hospital wearing her white coat and her stethoscope, and she was still the same brilliant surgeon she'd been before the flight. But something had changed inside her. She walked a little taller now, held her head a little higher. Because her daughter had reminded her that she didn't have to accept disrespect. That grace and kindness didn't mean tolerating abuse. That sometimes the most dignified thing you could do was fight back. Her colleagues at the hospital had seen the video. Everyone had seen the video. When Deborah walked into the surgical wing, the nurses and residents gave her a standing ovation. Not because she was married to a billionaire. Not because of the viral video. But because they understood. Because many of them had experienced similar situations. Because they were proud that she'd stood up, even if it was her daughter who delivered the final blow. And Naomi? Naomi went back to being a regular 8-year-old. Mostly. She went back to school, back to her advanced classes, back to her books and her science projects and her friends. She still read molecular biology textbooks for fun. She still asked questions that made her teachers scramble for answers. She still loved learning and exploring and figuring out how the world worked. But now she had a story. A story she'd carry with her for the rest of her life. A story about the day she stood up for her mother. About the day she learned that sometimes you have to fight. About the day she discovered that her voice, even though she was small and young and just a kid, could change things. Teachers at her school treated her differently. Not badly. Just with a new kind of respect. They'd seen the video too. They'd seen this polite, brilliant 8-year-old transform into a warrior when her mother needed protection. They understood that Naomi Sterling was someone special. Not because of her father's money. Not because of her mother's career. But because of who she was. What she valued. How she loved. Her classmates thought she was cool now. The girl who'd gone viral. The girl who'd stood up to a grown-up and won. Naomi handled the attention with the same quiet dignity she'd shown on the plane. She didn't brag. Didn't embellish. When kids asked her about it, she'd just shrug and say, "My mom needed help. So I helped her." Simple. True. Profound. At home, Barnabas had framed something and hung it in his office. Not an article about his company. Not a magazine cover. Not a picture of him accepting some award. He'd framed a screenshot from Silas's video. The moment Naomi was walking back down the aisle, her mother's phone in her hand, chin up, shoulders back, moving through that applauding cabin like royalty. Under the picture, he'd added a quote in simple lettering, "Never let anyone diminish your mother. She's a queen." Every time he looked at it, he felt pride. And pain. Pride in his daughter's courage. Pain that she'd needed to be that brave. But maybe that was what parenting was. Teaching your children to be brave in a world that would sometimes be cruel. Teaching them to stand up for themselves and for others. Teaching them that love sometimes looks like fierceness. That protecting the people you care about is worth the risk. The Sterling family didn't talk about the incident much after that first week. It had happened. They'd dealt with it. They'd moved on. But it had changed them, all three of them, in ways both visible and invisible. Deborah was less patient with disrespect now. More willing to call it out. More willing to assert herself. She'd always been strong, but now she was openly strong. Unapologetically strong. Barnabas had always been protective of his family, but now there was an edge to it. A watchfulness. A readiness. He'd seen his wife broken down by someone's casual cruelty, and he wasn't going to let it happen again if he could prevent it. And Naomi? Naomi carried the knowledge that she was capable of more than she'd thought. That when it mattered, when someone she loved was hurting, she could act. She could be brave. She could make a difference. Sometimes, late at night when Naomi was supposed to be asleep, Deborah would come into her room and sit on the edge of her bed. She'd stroke Naomi's cornrows, careful not to wake her, and she'd whisper thank you to this remarkable little person who'd fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself. And sometimes Naomi would whisper back, not quite asleep, "I love you, Mommy." "I love you too, baby. So much." "Mommy?" "Yes. You didn't need Daddy's name to deserve respect. You know that, right? You're amazing all by yourself." And Deborah would smile through tears. "I know, baby. But thank you for reminding them. Because that's what it came down to really. Not the viral video. Not the airline policy changes. Not the news coverage or the hashtags or the public apology. It came down to a daughter who loved her mother enough to fight for her. A daughter who saw injustice and refused to accept it. A daughter who understood at 8 years old that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stand up and say, "Enough." That's the real story of Flight 847. Not about a billionaire or a career ended or a video gone viral. It's about love. About family. About dignity. About the courage to stand up even when you're small and scared and the adults around you aren't doing enough. It's about Naomi Sterling, 8 years old, cornrows clicking with beads, purple dress and white sneakers, walking down an airplane aisle to get her mother's phone back and deliver 7 words that changed everything. Touch my mom one more time and find out. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. Sometimes the youngest among us see most clearly what's right and wrong. Sometimes justice doesn't need power or money or influence. Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to say, enough, and mean it. Sometimes it just needs an 8-year-old girl who loves her mother. Naomi Sterling taught us all something that day on Flight 847. She taught us that courage isn't about size or age or strength. It's about knowing what matters and being willing to stand up for it. It's about loving people fiercely enough to fight for them even when you're scared. It's about understanding that silence in the face of injustice is itself a choice, and sometimes the right choice is to speak up. She taught us that dignity is something you claim, not something someone else grants you. That respect should be freely given, but when it isn't, it must be demanded. That sometimes the people who need protecting are the ones who spend their lives protecting others. She taught us that children are watching, learning, absorbing not just what we tell them but what we show them. And when they see injustice, they're going to respond based on what we've taught them about right and wrong, about standing up for others, about the value of human dignity. Naomi Sterling is growing up now. Every day she's learning more about the world, about science and math and literature and history. But she's already learned the most important lesson. The one that matters most. Nobody treats my mommy that way. Nobody. 5 words. Simple words. Words spoken by a child. But words that contained everything that matters. Love. Protection. Dignity. Justice. Courage. If this story moved you, if Naomi's courage inspired you, if you believe that we all have a responsibility to stand up against injustice no matter how small or how young we are, then hit that subscribe button. Share this story. Let it remind you and others that change starts with individuals making brave choices in difficult moments. And here's my final question for you. When was the last time you stood up for someone who needed it? When was the last time you saw injustice and refused to be silent? When was the last time you chose courage over comfort? Drop your story in the comments. Because we all have moments where we're called to be brave. Where we're called to stand up. Where we're called to say, enough. The question is, when that moment comes, will you be ready? Will you be brave enough? Will you love deeply enough to fight for what's right? Naomi Sterling was, at 8 years old, on an airplane, when her mother needed her most. She was ready. She was brave. She fought. And she won. Nobody treats my mommy that way. Nobody. Remember those words. Live by those words. Stand up for the people you love. Stand up for yourself. Stand up for what's right. Be like Naomi. The world needs more people like Naomi Sterling.